Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Ledwan, Senior Director and Microsoft Consultant with Virteva. I've been working with Virteva for close to a decade and specialize in service delivery, advisory consulting, workshops, and training. Thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a great discussion about forming a zero trust blueprint while utilizing Microsoft's cloud security services. I'm joined today by two experts in the Microsoft cloud services space. The first is Chris Strong, Senior Director of Microsoft Solutions at Virteva, and the second is Taylor Koken, a consultant for our Microsoft Cloud Security and Endpoint Management Group with Virteva. Taylor, take a moment to introduce yourself to the group.
Yeah, hi, I'm Taylor Koken. Like Scott said, I specialize in the security and endpoint features of the Microsoft Cloud Security Stack. I've been doing this now for about 3 years, and I love what I do, so I'm excited to talk about Zero Trust today.
Great. Thanks, Taylor. Chris, why don't you do the same?
Yes, thank you very much, Scott. It's great to be here. Excited to talk about what is a very exciting topic, in my opinion, with Zero Trust. So I'm, as Scott mentioned, our Senior Director of Microsoft Solutions. Been here about 9 years and have the entire time been focused on the Microsoft stack and all of the different aspects of what ultimately is Microsoft 365 and more broadly the security realm. So just happy to be able to have these kinds of conversations and talk, kind of nerd out, I guess you could call it, on all things security and zero trust.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Before we begin, I wanted to share a quick knowledge slide on Virteva. Virteva is a preferred Microsoft partner who can help all organizations in this realm from end to end. We've been delivering technology-focused workshops and helping customers as implementation partners and specialists all the way back since 2005. As a quick housekeeping item before we get started here, we're planning to stick around at the end of the webcast to answer any audience questions. You can submit those directly through the Teams chat panel at the top of Teams, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as time for allows. If there's anything that we can't get to, we'll reply back to those via email. All right, Chris and Taylor, let's get things kicked off. Today, people are working remotely from both business-owned and personally owned devices. Threat actors are eagerly seeking opportunities to penetrate networks, phish, drop malware in the networks, and the safety and security of the classic in-office perimeter have become outdated as we need to protect data, devices, identities, both on our networks and now in the cloud. As security operators, we need to adjust our view today to plan for tomorrow. As a concept, what does zero trust represent? And why is it so crucial to all organizations not only comprehend what it is, but also to adhere to it? Chris, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So it's been interesting. Zero trust as a concept has been around a good portion of time, several years at this point. It's been nice to see it evolve in a way that it's been more clearly understood and frankly more consistently applied. There's in the earlier days kind of was confusion around, well, how do we, this means this way to us versus, the next party thought of it a different way. And thankfully, through initiatives not unlike the federal government even adopting a zero trust kind of stance, the Biden administration just earlier this year introduced an executive order that essentially mandated, among other things, that all federal agencies adopt a zero trust model. And I think what's nice about those types of avenues when that kind of a thing occurs, not only that, but Microsoft itself getting very strongly behind zero trust as well, it forces everything to be standardized that much more and more consistently applied. And frankly, makes it less confusing, I think, in how organizations can understand for themselves how to properly approach, apply, think about, and ultimately get to an optimal stage of attainment within it. Certainly within our experience over the years, it's been, it's sort of a journey as well. The more mature kind of state that it's in today has helped because it is, if even the federal government, frankly, is doing it finally, it's kind of like, well, everyone else should be already. They're usually the last to finally kind of come around to these things, particularly in the cybersecurity front, unfortunately, maybe to a certain degree. But at the same time, we're all susceptible, and it's kind of proven itself at this point that, even though assume breach, as we'll get into, is one of the core concepts, it does lend itself to the idea that if we apply this effectively and we do get as close as possible or ultimately achieve that optimal state within a zero trust framework, we are significantly limiting the amount of damage that could ever occur to our organization. We're going to make ourselves a lot harder target, so that even if somebody does try, or really not if, but when, we're going to be so kind of resilient and able to be widespread sort of attacked, they're going to move on to easier targets. And I'm so unfortunate that that next target hopefully isn't as easy as they think it will be, but at least for ourselves, we've protected ourselves to a significant degree in ways that don't really necessarily have to be debilitating to the organization and its ability to do its work and to operate as a business. And that's the other kind of nice part, is the tools themselves that have allowed zero trust models to be applied, particularly in the Microsoft context, have gotten a lot more mature themselves and have made it much more practical to live in a much more resilient security state without feeling like you've blocked half of the ways that your users were able to do things in the past. And so just to kind of unpack these a little bit, when we talk about zero trust, what are we actually implying? And so in the core model, while there's other sub layers to it, the three foundational principles are: one, verifying explicitly, and we'll unpack that a little bit; two, using least privileged access. So the days of, hey, I have an admin cred, so I just do whatever I want, right? I have an admin cred, I can just go to this server if I feel like it. No more. We got to stop that, because that's its own grave risk, that if that account was compromised, or if that was a malicious actor in some way, or what we've seen in the more recent attack structures where they can impersonate an admin credential, a lot of bad stuff can result from that. So we need to more explicitly say that if you're going to do something, it has to be just in time and for a justifiable reason, regardless of who you are, even if you're the global admin or any other type of role within the organization. And then lastly, assume breach. And that's, in our experience, been one of the more let's call it tougher journeys for organizations, just to live in that mindset that, it's so, for so long, everyone was like, well, we'll just, make ourselves so rigid and harden ourselves that we don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. We've covered all our bases. Well, it just doesn't work that way. There's inevitably sophisticated attacks that proliferate now with ransomware as a service, and the accessibility to malicious exploits that are being basically sold on their own marketplaces on the dark web and other places. It's an impossibility to delude ourselves into thinking that we can stop everything all the time. And so rather than try to fight that losing battle, let's, in applying these, assume that mentality that it's going to happen. We are going to be attacked. In fact, I would guarantee to a large degree, or have a great degree of certainty, that as I speak, my company, Virteva, is under attack and is probably actively, at least being attempted to be breached. And that's okay. We know that that's, well, it's not okay, but it's okay in the sense that we have a resilient framework in place through zero trust that limits, to a large degree, any of the possible damage that could occur from that, through that isolation, through that stratification of these principles, to make sure that that certainty of that breach doesn't have the ability to actually do what the bad guys really care about, which is make money or do significant damage to our company. And if we just solve for that part of the equation, 9 times out of 10, we're going to walk away, unfazed or untarnished, and live to fight another day and avoid that next breach. So to kind of unpack these a little further, when we say something like verify explicitly, there's various ways to consider that. There's the tools aspect, but then there's also kind of the political and cultural aspect and the procedural aspect within every organization. And that's a one piece that I think a lot of orgs also not struggle with, but need to make sure they're accounting for, is the technology and the tools to allow for this are extremely important, but they're not the sole part of the equation. We still need to have our security and sort of general user operations formulated around this, and we need to have the reactivity and the consistency and the service management elements around this that allow us to live perpetually in readiness to maintain this state. And so when we talk about verifying explicitly, we're looking at things like variables, the user's identity themselves, the Active Directory object that represents that user. What can we glean with that as a variable that can be called on to decide, should this user be able to go here right now? Whether it's this service, this application, accessing this particular data, whatever it happens to be. And let's look at different attributes associated with that user object, such as the location of the user, such as the device that they're on, such as the anomalistic qualities that may exist in relation to that user. They've been in Minneapolis working from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day from this IP range. Now all of a sudden they're in Mexico logging in, or now all of a sudden they're in Beijing logging in. that's an anomaly. It doesn't necessarily mean they've been breached per se, although there's maybe, depending on the anomaly, a better chance of that. But let's not just implicitly trust that. Let's make sure, because some anomalous element has been surfaced, that we reconsider what they're trying to do in that moment. And that's the key, is it has to happen kind of on a constant basis. It's not like, oh, we set this rule, so that's good for everything. No, in the moment, we need to have a just-in-time evaluation of all those variables. User and device, certainly a big part of that on the user side of things. But even for non-user devices, even for other workloads like servers and other things, how can we properly measure and continuously monitor what state they're in? Not even just the location and things like that, but the health of the device, either that the user or that the non-user based device exhibits. Has it run an antivirus scan in the last 24 hours? Has it caught any specific malicious activity or sort of anomalous qualities on the device itself? Let's measure that and through that variable decide, okay, with what action is about to be taken, does that seem like safe enough to allow them to do this thing or not? And we can automate a lot of that type of visibility. And so it's not humans that necessarily have to account for all those variables, but we get the tools aligned in an array in which they can effectively measure that in a real-time sense as these activities are occurring organization-wide. Looking at the actual service or workload itself, obviously, is a big part of the variability there. Data classification is another one that we tend to see a lot of orgs, in a longer-term sense. That's not, when we look at, as we'll get into a little later, so to the pathway of prioritization and evolution to attain an optimal zero trust state. Data classification is often one of those last miles because it is such a cultural difference in how they've operated as a business in a longer term sense, and getting into that mindset and that culture as a company of saying every piece of data we create should have some sort of classification to it. Doesn't mean everything's top secret, so certainly far from that, but it does mean everything has to have a label applied so that we can decide, let's know that this exists, certainly, but then also let's decide, what does that classification imply about the level of security that's be associated with it? When we're setting up our policies based on what users are trying to do and measuring against all those variables, how much do we want to look at the data classification itself as a measurable variable that decides whether that user in their state and the device that they're on all marries up to something we want to allow or block or be aware of or control for, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's a big one, and there's a lot to get into with that, but it is one of the more necessary components of zero trust to be able to do that effectively. And the other way to look at that, between verify explicitly and as we get into privileged access, there's this idea too of why zero trust, because the perimeter isn't the safest edge that it used to be. In the old days where we could have just a firewall and various other tools at the edge, and once you got through via VPN or if you're on the LAN, okay, once you're in, then you're safe, quote unquote. It's not safe anymore. It's not practical. It's not to say those things aren't still necessary to some degree, and it's not to say that they're irrelevant, just that they're not solely sufficient any longer. With cloud being such a predominant part of most organizations' infrastructure and data estate and all these other pieces, we need to account for even the inside source. Even though you've made it through the firewall, even though you're on the VPN, it doesn't imply that you're safe necessarily. You still need to verify deeper than that. And so with least privileged access, kind of goes hand in hand with verifying explicitly, in the sense that, as I alluded to a few moments ago, let's look at, as these actions occur, deciding in that just-in-time sense, is this a valid scenario that's playing out? Is this user somebody that should have access to this data or this device or this workload or this action that they're about to take? Is that device applicable to that? Is the status of other variables sufficient to suggest that this is a safe element? So there's that just-in-time piece, and then just enough access. Let's not sit around with all these elevated credentials all the time, like kind of in an old school sense has always been the way of it, especially in IT and security teams, where they're all sitting there with admin creds. Now, I hope to goodness for all of you that are watching this, that you're not using that as your primary account and that you're maintaining separate admin accounts that aren't your main day-to-day one. But even in that circumstance, we still need to make sure that even those admin credentials are de-elevated and have kind of an inert quality to them, and only elevate to the just enough level of access they need to do the action they're about to take. Hey, I need to do a patch cycle on these servers. Okay, let's grant you that elevated admin credential in that small window of time that you need it to do that work, and then automatically de-elevate it subsequent to that, so that even if that account was compromised, even though it's technically an admin account, it's de-elevated most of the time. So whoever gets access to that isn't really going to be able to just do whatever they want. Or if we were to get that one compromised, it allows the bad guys to skip ahead to all the nasty stuff that they would want to do, and frankly be able to cover their tracks while they do it. And then, there's an element with least privileged access around adaptive policies. So adapting your policies to be able to be adaptable to the scenarios, the personnel, et cetera. And this is where the tools can play a big role in that, obviously. Although even before the tools themselves are applied, it still requires a lot of thought and introspection as an organization to say who should have access to these things, when, and what are the justifications? What are the approval workflows going to look like so that we can make sure that they have the right associations, and that when they want to do it at that time, that it is the actual action that we want to sanction as an organization. And then just getting all that in place. And then with the assumed breach part, as we've kind of spoken to that already a little bit, but what that implies in a zero trust context is let's make sure we're creating enough segmentation within our environment so that in the event a breach does, which it will happen, really they're isolated. It's that one endpoint and they can't really get any farther than that, or that one application, or that one service, or that one data pool that's very, very segmented, so that, it sucks and we'll have to react to that and make sure that it's addressed, but they're not going to get much farther than that. And so instead of the entire team having to spend a week, or God forbid, we've seen some companies go bankrupt because everything got ransomwared, and now they got to try and decrypt all that, and they pay the ransom, and then it still corrupts half the data through the decryption process and all the bad stuff around that. Plus, just the idea that we don't want to have to pay these bad actors, because then we're just funding the next attack that they're going to be able to do and make them that much more successful. Let's make sure there's that segmentation in place so that it's really never going to get to the point where when they do ransomware us, it's not worth paying for. We can recover from that because they're not going to get to the rest of our environment. And then encryption. So encryption is a big part of that landscape. Let's make sure that even if they did somehow find a way to get access to this data, even in a segmented sense, so just that small pool of data, they can't really do anything with it. They could ransomware it, but they can't actually view it. And we're seeing more of a proliferation of those sort of additional layers of these attacks, where their goal isn't just to make you have a bad time and make you pay to get your data back, but they're actually looking at the data itself. There was just an attack from a North Korean based malicious party, I guess, the Holy Ghost attack that I was just reading about the other day. And that was a core aspect of that attack, was not just to make money off of the ransomware itself to get the company to pay, but actually as part of the threat saying, if you don't pay us within 24 hours, we will go to all of the customer data that we just evaluated in all your files and tell them, and then we'll go to the press and we'll just make your company really hate their life for a while, because we're going to expose you that way. And it's part of that threat mechanism that they're trying to do now. So we need to encrypt as much as we can, even if it's innocuous data, to make sure that even if it was to be exposed, they can't actually consume it. And then using a lot of analytics and just having that awareness, getting that operational state to say, when those breaches occur, while we've got ourselves isolated fairly well, and there's a lot of that segmentation, we still need to react. We still need to jump on it. And we still need to have that good holistic process and cycles and awareness on our team. What do we do? What is our action plan? What are the next stages that we take? How do we make sure we've eradicated these things so they don't lie in wait and hit us again later on? And then how do we also make sure that our end users throughout our organization are good stewards? Because we can do all the fancy tool stuff, and it's always some user that's going to be our worst kind of source of compromise. And so how do we get them properly in a position to make sure that they're not part of the problem, but a part of the solution? Taylor, you mind taking it from there?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris, for the deep dive into our zero trust principles. I'll kind of go over, there's this slide here that'll kind of explain the 6 pillars of what zero trust is. So these 6 pillars are identities, endpoints, application, data, infrastructure, and network. And there's controls applied to all of these layers, and then there's also applying those controls to those layers. So these kind of fit into those 3 the basic tenets that Chris already discussed. So zero trust, really what it's going to do for the explicit verification is force your organization to double and triple check users' attributes before allowing them or providing them access to the data or application they're actively trying to access, right? So essentially these checks create a new identity for that user that's a collection of all of the information about their access at that time. So it's going to break down their identity of just their username, password, and then MFA on top of it. It's going to go into endpoint. So what device are they signing in from? Is the device Azure AD joined? Is it hybrid Azure AD joined? Is the device compliant with your corporate endpoint policies? And is that device even in the end allowed to access your environment? From the network infrastructure, what location are they signing in from, right? Is this their usual sign-in location like Chris alluded to? Are they all of a sudden signing in from a new country that they don't sign into? Basically, to answer the question, should they be signing in from this location? And then the application itself, right? Do they have access to it? Is it a secure application that they need further roles or need to re-authenticate one more time in order to access? So all of those items kind of come together to create the new identity for that explicit verification. So no longer are you allowing just a sign in based off of a username, password, and then MFA. You're allowing sign in and access based off of all of those attributes that come from identities, endpoints, applications, data, infrastructure, and network. And then, as Chris alluded to, even when that access is provided, you're providing access to what they need in order to complete their task, and only that, and then only the amount of time they'll need to actually complete said task, to avoid the fact avoid the case where they're stuck with, maybe access to an entire SharePoint site, for example, that they don't need access to. Maybe they only needed 5 or 6 files. We see it all the time where users are not very good at sharing specific files. They'll share out an entire folder, and that link will just live indefinitely, and people will be able to access it for an indefinite period of time where they really only needed access to 3 files for 15 days, for example. Lastly, just make sure that all the information from this is logged so that your security team can review it at a different time. We'll dive into this a little bit further with the M365 stack inside of things that does a really good job of actually auditing and giving you information on all this activity. But you want to be able to go back and review it so you can see who checked out an admin role. You can see who changed permissions on a file. You can see who changed a setting within an Azure database. So again, basically all of this stuff comes together for that explicit verification to say, nope, I don't care that your username and password works. I do care, but I don't care just about that. I care that the device you're using is correct, the data you're accessing you actually have access to, and the location you're signing in from is a reasonable location to sign in from, for example. And then I say, yep, I've explicitly verified that all of your access attributes are correct and accurate. So yep, now you can access our data. So when you're taking all of these layers together to create sort of that explicit verification, you also then want to kind of go back and apply these controls across these various different layers, right? You're going to be applying these things to identities, endpoints, applications, data, infrastructure, and network, because if you don't, you can bet that the bad actors are going to find a way to get into the least secure parts of your environment. So you can spend all the time in the world on your endpoints, harden them as much as possible. But what if your O365 environment isn't locked down enough and you're getting phished all the time? That device hardening really doesn't matter at that point. So again, just make sure that Zero Trust is really just aimed to explicitly verify through this large collection to provide access to that data just when needed and just in time. And then in the end, log it, control it, and always assume that something bad is going to happen, like a breach, so that these controls are in place to, one, lock down the breach as quickly as possible. Oops, I accidentally clicked a button. Sorry. Lock down the breach as quickly as possible. And then after that, clean it up and also log the breach so you know what happened and can go in the future and repair any damages that will be done. So Scott, I'll kick it back over to you for our slide that I accidentally clicked forward to.
Yeah, no problem. And great coverage on both the principles and kind of the posture management there. One of the key things that we didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about, though, is just what's directly in the center of the screen is. You're going to go out there, you're going to configure all of your posture management, you're going to get your principles and the basic understanding done, but you have to keep on going through that loop over and over again because things are going to change. Nothing remains the same forever. This is the whole reason why we're moving from the perimeter around the 4 walls of the building to the perimeter around the device, the perimeter around the application, the perimeter around the user. Is it's just going to continue to change and evolve, and Zero Trust today might be completely different 10 years from now.
Yeah, and if I can make one more comment on that slide, Scott, real quick. One of the other kind of variables to this that goes beyond the technology itself is the humans, in the sense that the IT and security side and how to effectively live within this model. And obviously, organization to organization, there's different sizes, right? If you're a mid-market or especially an SMB, usually you don't have the luxury from an IT budget perspective to have a dedicated security team and then a dedicated IT team that sort of collaborate and have their own hierarchy and structure and leadership chain and all that. Obviously, as you get larger into the enterprise space, there is more of that dedicated security team. But what we have seen in a real world sense, for better for worse, is a little bit of a us versus them mentality between IT and security. Not every, I'm not trying to paint with too broad of a brush, but let's just say anecdotally it comes up enough where security kind of operates on their own plane of existence, and they're like, hey, IT, here's what you're going to do. And you're just going to do what we tell you because we're security and we call the shots. And that's livable to an extent. But frankly, the more effective organizations that we've seen, often that we've helped or that we've come into, is when security and IT collaborate and they work together. Where security says, well, these are the ultimate. So, in the zero trust context, we want to get to this. We want to get to that state, and we want to live resiliently in the zero trust model. IT, let's collaborate on that. Let's not just order you to do something. Let's help you as an IT group help us. And when we look at that application layer, that data layer, that infrastructure, network, identity, endpoint, there's a lot of value that the IT team and their knowledge of the technologies being applied just to manage and supply that functionality can have integrated with the security team. And with zero trust, it can't be stated firmly enough that collaborating between IT and security is a much more livable way to stay in this state, and as Scott alluded to, have that cyclical process successfully applied than two siloed kind of groups that just sort of are at each other's throats saying, well, I'm IT, I have to care about the user experience, and I have to care about the way we just allow this technology to make sure we can run as a business. And then security saying, well, we think about that and we care about that, but at the end of the day, we're on the hook for all the security elements to it. There's a better together quality to that. And so, just to kind of put that seed in everyone's head, find ways to bridge those divides at that CIO and CISO level. If you have those roles in your organization, working together is always going to be a much more effective plan to actually make this successful.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So now that we know a little bit more about zero trust as a concept, I have a couple of questions to pose to you. Is it monolithic, and how can organizations rank their readiness? But also, what are their first steps? Is the idea limited to just one discipline? How do they gauge where their readiness is at? How do they gauge where their growth is at? And how do they develop against it?
Yes, great question. And I know Taylor's going to have a lot to say in here. This is something he's definitely near and dear to, and I'll save a lot of it for him to kind of get into. But at a high level, no, it's not monolithic, especially in the context of how to effectively get to an optimal state. And frankly, that's in our experience and why we kind of put this into the mix as far as something we want to talk about today, is because we have seen struggles at organizations when they kind of treated it as a binary or a black and white type of scenario. It's like, well, we're not zero trust, and now we're just going to be zero trust. It's much more effective to figure out where, how far along are we? Inevitably, most organizations find themselves either inadvertently or deliberately to some degree in alignment with this. Rarely do we see it like where they've already kind of got all the way to an optimal state, but inevitably there's some level of that in place. And then from there deciding, okay, how do we, start breaking down the different elements to say, how do we get to the next crawl, kind of walk to run, to use the cliche term, so that we've accounted for all the different variables. We've learned to kind of inherit all that, new structure for how we're applying security, how we're applying these tools. But then in addition, for that user experience, for the part that does have to matter, how do we go at a cadence and in a structural way so that the business actually doesn't get disrupted from it? And that's the worst outcome that we want to avoid, is if we go too far too fast, or we don't properly do our due diligence along the way and structure this in a more kind of practical and reasonable prioritization strategy, that it pisses everyone off. And then the leadership team's hearing all the complaints from the business saying, hey, all of a sudden all this stuff we were doing doesn't work anymore and we can't do our jobs. And then they tell you to rip it all out, and you've lost all that inertia, all that goodwill with the organization side. And so it really can make a huge difference, as Taylor's going to kind of showcase here, to stage this, do your due diligence at each stage, and closer and closer get to that optimal state. And then you're not done at that point, but at least you've reached kind of the top of the mountain, and now it's that sustainability factor that you freed up to do at that point. So go ahead and take it from there, Taylor.
Sounds good. Thank you, Chris. So sort of like Chris alluded to, we have what we call optimization stages, right? And what we're doing here is basically just categorizing where you're at in the zero trust process, saying like, you're starting off with nothing. It's, we're going to have to deploy everything from square one all the way to optimal, where every single zero trust security control that we can think of, you have implemented, and you're basically kind of like waiting on the edge for the next stuff to come out, right? The security and leadership teams in that case, are just sitting there kind of waiting to implement those future controls. So every company is going to be likely in a different stage. Each organization is different, especially when it comes to organizational resources. So that's something that I'll kind of discuss here with some of the real world experiences that I've ran into doing these assessments, deploying this stuff. There's a few kind of trip ups that I'll kind of discuss, and then we'll kind of get into sort of how we do our assessment and how we aim to help with some of those problems. So the first one is this distinct trust in organizations, that where you just believe a user is who they say they are because that's how it's been in the past, right? Whether it's a user signing into their account or they're even calling their service desk to have their password changed and they don't need to verify themselves. Explicitly verifying people like that, especially over the phone or something, is uncomfortable. And sometimes it can cause users to feel like IT is the big brother that's always kind of looking over their shoulder all the time, right? Because zero trust is not a checklist that you follow to complete totally, right? It's a security architecture. It's going to bring in changes to the way your standard users and even your administrators go about their day-to-day work. So the biggest thing, like, we are an MSP, right? We do service desk support, we do L2 support, we do all kinds of support for customers. So it's really important that you don't ignore that end user impact and admin impact, and then especially the VIP user impact. If you're clearly communicating your zero trust control changes to your end users first, your IT teams, and then even hand-holding your IT admins and your VIP users, it's going to help you a lot in the future because you're going to get that initial buy-in from those admins and those VIP users. And that brings me to another point. One of the biggest pain points we've ran into, surprisingly, is administrators themselves, right? In the past, administrators are used to having a global admin or even a domain admin role, for example, assigned to them, and being able to sign in whenever and wherever they want to. It's a hard concept to change. Oops, sorry, I talk with my hands a lot. It's a hard concept to change because they have to, check out their admin roles all the time, all of a sudden, and they have to sign in from their work computer that's maybe not as powerful as their home computer they use, that's got 128 gigs of RAM and 2 graphics cards in it or whatever, right? The idea, though, is that it's called zero trust for a reason. Nobody is excluded from that explicit verification, because once you start to exclude people, one, it's not zero trust anymore, and two, other people will hear about that and expect to be excluded. If somebody does need to be excluded from a zero trust control, again, you're going to bring in that explicit verification, verify that they're able to be excluded, exclude them when they need to, and then re-add them to that control is immediately after they're excluded. So again, just really communicate with the impacted end users, which is going to be pretty much everybody in this case. Talk to your IT admins, get their buy-in, make sure they understand how their sign-in process is going to change. Make sure those end users understand that I can't sign in from my living room computer that my children have access to anymore. It's only a compliant, hybrid Azure AD joined device that I can access my Outlook on anymore, or maybe my phone with something like MAM implemented. But again, just don't start off with getting as much buy-in as you can, and then exclude people if absolutely necessary for a short amount of time, so you don't get the rules for thee but not for me mindset in your company. Because I can promise that putting down those controls and upsetting or making people's days a little bit harder for a couple of weeks is worth it when you avoid a breach, because those VIPs and those IT admins are going to be much more upset when that breach finally happens because these controls aren't in place. So I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about our Virteva assessment and how kind of we aim to help with this stuff. So when we do our assessments, we'll kind of categorize what stage of optimization your organization is in to start off with, and what security controls and processes you have in place today. And then we'll talk to your team about, what pain points have you had already? Do you have some people who don't like Microsoft at all, which we've seen, plenty of times where people just refuse to believe that Microsoft can be a valid security tool because of how Microsoft was, 5-10 years ago, and they could honestly care less, it seemed like. After we get sort of that clear picture of where you are based on these optimization stages, we'll basically just kind of create a roadmap and help you move forward with it, right? We'll go into more detail about the actual assessment itself, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But the idea really is that slow progress is always going to be better than no progress. And our goal is to help organizations with a clear set of security process changes that you can implement that at a pace that best fits your organization, right? We're not saying like this has to be done immediately because everybody's IT resources are different. Everybody has different sized teams. Everybody's got projects going on all the time. Nobody can drop everything and work on zero trust all day as much as we'd like to do that. But yeah, like I said, slow progress, better than no progress. And we really are going to aim to help with just sets of recommendations that we can make for your organization to kind of help you move forward. And with that, Scott, I will kick it back to you.
Yeah, and thanks, Taylor. I really appreciate kind of the insight and the view that you have on that. It really does extend across the entire organization. So it starts all the way kind of down at the bottom rung with like your first level customer service rep, and it goes all the way up to the CEO. As soon as you start making exceptions, that's where this model starts to fall apart and starts to kind of put us back into the spot that we're at right now.
And one point I did want to mention too that I kind of forgot to touch on is the people that most often want to be excluded from your zero trust controls are the people that are going to be focused on the most by bad actors. It's going to be your global admins, your IT admins, and your C-level executives because they have the most privileged accounts. And in the C-level case, their stuff is out there. Everybody can find their email. So, if you want to scare yourself, go into your Azure environment and look at your CEO and how many times they try to sign into, your CEO's account on a daily basis because they have his email. They're just trying to brute force it. So that's the only other thing I wanted to touch on, but give it back to you, Scott. Thanks.
All right. So Taylor kind of already started going down this road, but we're going to start kind of talking a little bit more about the idea of zero trust and its importance and how to get there, but also what role does Microsoft's security toolkit play in this endeavor, and how does Virteva kind of continue to advise on best practice for businesses? How do you pursue zero trust using those tools? With that, I'll toss it back to you, Chris.
Yeah, this is going to be mostly the Taylor show on this one, but I'm going to at least give you the preamble that we still find generally that most orgs don't realize, especially if they already own Microsoft 365. Not to say that it entirely addresses the entirety of zero trust as a framework, because there's the infrastructure side and the network side, but that is to say a lot of the tools in Microsoft 365 alone are sufficient to get you a significant amount of the way towards zero trust. And just how much on the security plane of existence Microsoft has bundled into these things. And so a lot of the time, we spend a good portion of our initial dialogues with organizations, especially those that haven't worked with us before, helping reveal to them like how much has just been sitting there that they didn't realize was in the stack that they already owned in many cases, that is capable of achieving, even in just M365, I'd call it about 60 to 70% of zero trust, especially on the identity side, and some of the endpoint related security elements, and various other attributes there. With the other side of it being then from an infrastructure perspective, certainly in the Azure realm, for the network and infrastructure side, although not solely that, but Microsoft has all the technologies essentially under their umbrella from a security tool perspective that it essentially could be utilized even if you're using AWS or GCP for your infrastructure, or even on-premises data center-based stuff, to essentially address the entire framework of zero trust. And so it's not a situation where you necessarily have to worry about, okay, if we want to get here, we got to buy 50 of this and 100 of that, and we got 50 different vendor tools that we're bringing into the environment. There is something to be said to have some diversity, but at the same time, if we think about it, if we're sitting there with 30 different security tools, we got to remember that the procedural matters as well. Our response time, our response consistency, our quality of response, because we're assuming breach, when these breaches occur. And so it can work against us if our security team or our IT/security team has to go into 8 different portals just to say, okay, did this happen here? Does this happen there? If you have a SIEM, that can help consolidate that to a degree. But consistency in tools, an array, and the ability for those tools to talk to each other can go a very long way to not only achieving zero trust, but to make it livable, to make it operationally viable for our organization. And so as Taylor's kind of go into, at least, we happen to be Microsoft specialists, so this is our bread and butter and what we most focus on. So it's not to say it's the only way to approach zero trust. We've just found it extremely effective and extremely comprehensive. So if Taylor, you don't mind, we can kind of start to unpack it from there.
Absolutely. So Chris kind of already helped answer this, but why Microsoft 365, right? Why are we doing a workshop that's zero trust, but through Microsoft 365? Well, easy answer. Well, because Microsoft is all aboard the zero trust train themselves. They have white papers on it. They have a ton of documentation about how they're embracing the zero trust security architecture. And with that comes a ton of cloud-based security options, and some on-prem that implement most of these controls that we've already discussed. So forgive me as I rattle off a bunch of different products here that will help you implement these controls. So Microsoft has things like conditional access through Azure, right? Applying real-time controls to those sign-ins at all times or at specific times based on those attributes we talked about earlier. Then you have like Azure Identity Protection, more of a reactive and proactive cloud security control for your cloud identities to evaluate user risk and sign-in risk. You have Defender for Identity that is like on-premise account controls. I keep doing that implement security controls for like leak password detection. If somebody's trying to brute force one of your on-prem accounts. And then you have Microsoft Endpoint Manager for device controls, implementing security controls on devices, things like Application Guard, Device Guard, Credential Guard, BitLocker. You jump down and then to like Defender for endpoint detection and response, Defender for Office 365 for security controls in your Exchange and Office 365 environments, controlling anti-spam, anti-phish, and anti-impersonation rules. And then outside of the direct O365 side, you're jumping into then Defender for Cloud Apps, which has the ability to be a cloud app security broker for all cloud applications that your users could access, right? You can review their access, review what kind of apps they're accessing, block access to those ones that you don't want them to be going to. You can even start to control files inside of those third-party applications and then apply those conditional access controls to cloud applications that are way outside of the O365 stack. Even then Defender for Cloud. So like Chris said, things like not just Azure security controls, but AWS and GCP for those cloud-based infrastructure network controls. Microsoft Purview that brings in compliance on top of it. So Purview information protection for those file and sensitive data controls. Data loss prevention to prevent that movement of sensitive data, retention policies, insider risk management, even to go as granular as saying, oh, this user's leaving in 3 days. Let's review their activity a little bit more closely to make sure they're not downloading a ton of our intellectual property. And then privileged identity management, which is otherwise known as PIM, which helps you provide that just enough and just in time access specifically for your admin and applications. So you can provide people admin access, but they have to check out that specific role and they only get it for maybe 2 or 3 hours, right? So with all of these controls, like Chris kind of alluded to, I promise once you start on your zero trust journey and start to implement all of these Microsoft cloud solutions, you're going to be like, if you don't have one already, you're going to be begging for a SIEM tool because all of these are going to create a ton of different alerts. The proactive side of things is the quicker part, to be honest. You're setting up the policies, pushing them out. The hardest part about that is really that end user communication and letting them know exactly what's going on. But after that, you have the reactive, where all of these tools are firing off, hundreds of alerts a day that your SOC team all of a sudden has to manage that they didn't before. So with Sentinel, you have that sort of single pane of glass that you can go to view all of those security alerts, start to automate things, and then control false positives and things like that to sort of ingest all that data for you without making some poor person on your SOC team spend 24/7 looking through security data. Because of all the stuff that I just listed off, that was probably couple minutes of just listing off Microsoft security products and what they do, right? We totally understand that it's overwhelming for any team to fully understand and then plan out how to align in all of these security tools into what a zero trust state is, not to mention operationalize them and then make them sustainable for long-term organization growth. So hopefully, as we get into this next section, we can help with that, right? We can help with explaining, implementing, and creating a plan to effectively operationalize and manage these tools. Because if you don't, not only is it a security issue, but you're also just wasting money because chances are with your licensing, you're paying for all this stuff already. You might as well utilize it. But with that, I'll kick back over to Scott to talk about how we start off on a zero trust journey.
Sure. Thanks, Taylor. And just
Yep.
very similar to kind of how I left off last time about continuously doing improvements, Microsoft is doing this on their side too. So just this past July, 2022, is they kind of rolled out a new umbrella for some of their products called Microsoft Entra. So we're really starting to see them dip more into cloud management for privileged identity around AWS, Azure, and GCP. They're also doing more with identity management with the acquisition of CloudKnox that happened last year. And we're starting to see them actually just this week. Verified ID went into general availability. So we're continuing to see this product evolve. And I think as time goes on over the next couple of years, as Microsoft continues to add trains to the bullet train that is security, is we will continue to see more products come out of that and more evolution on the current products.
Yeah, that universal identity concept is going to be all everyone hears about for a while. It seems like that's not just Microsoft, but several, Apple and Google are all kind of pursuing that. I do think Microsoft has the edge in their long and historically sort of excellent identity platform, but it's going to be interesting to see how that kind of takes over the conversation in a lot of ways in the future.
Mhm.
Right. So the last big question I have for you guys today is, how do I begin my zero trust journey? And this question is one that many CISOs and security teams and even CEOs find the most challenging is, how can I get started? Where do I go? Chris, how can Virteva assist organizations in understanding not only Microsoft's security stack, but also how zero trust helps it make it work, but doesn't make them feel lost, overburdened, or like they feel like they have to spend the next 6 to 18 months getting themselves ready for this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Taylor said it well. It's a lot to take in. And it's kind of going back to why we highly recommend going in that phased and structured approach, because it is a lot of pieces and components and all that different stratification of how to apply these things, whether they're going to impact just a technical aspect or a user aspect or a process aspect or governance, compliance. There's a lot of pieces here. And so what we like to do is start at the very beginning with assessing. We need to figure out where you are. And then on top of that, and Taylor's going to unpack that some more, but also help educate the team. As we start throwing around Defender this and Defender that, and as we start throwing around identity and all these things, at least in the Microsoft context, we always like to start with the idea that let's get the team of an understanding of what these things are, how they work, but more importantly, how it means something to them, and especially how it applies to the zero trust model that they're trying to attain. And so for us, one of our unique offerings for a long time has been our Microsoft 365 Crash Course Workshop, which goes end to end. That's not just for security, but that's everything in Microsoft 365. But more recently, we've created a new product that more specifically focuses on Microsoft 365 security. Still good old Crash Course, but it really lasers in on all the different security elements, as well as Taylor is going to get into appends an assessment aspect that really helps us narrow in on your zero trust strategy, zero trust evolution, prepares you to actually get to that optimal state over time. And we've gotten a lot of good feedback over the years in general with our Crash Course product, just in its uniqueness and its ability to educate and inform beyond the typical manner, right? Beyond just, hey, look at this stuff, look what it does, look at this demo. That's good, and it's not to say those are bad things, but more holistically, we found it resonates and frankly is more effective to make it real to you. You're not benefiting necessarily all the time when you see some demo that's generalized for a million other places. Let's make sure that there's an understanding of how each of these security tools would apply if you're company A, if you're company B, if you're in healthcare or manufacturing industry or retail industry. Let's really break it down in a minute way to help stratify these things as it relates to your specific business. And that's not even just in a technical sense, but cultural, political, sort of business outcomes. All of those are important. If you're ultimately going to be successful with zero trust, I personally feel like it's necessary, essentially, to understand the continuity and the context of these things in all of those lanes, so to speak, or those swim lanes that go beyond just, can it do X, can it do Y? And so that's, for us, been a common thing, is to do these security crash courses, and then followed on by the assessment aspect that Taylor's about to get into. And we've had a lot of success, frankly, and a lot of good feedback from a lot of organizations that have done this, that it's really helped them get a handle on where they're at and kind of understand what the journey is going to be and what it's going to take to get that optimal zero trust state. and then what the actual components themselves are doing and how they fit into that roadmap to make sure that they get there effectively. So Taylor, take it from here.
You got it. Yeah, so I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but starting off with the M365 security crash course workshop is really a great idea because, I mean, I quickly went over a bunch of the Microsoft security products earlier, but it really, if you don't understand those products or know what they do, it really is a good idea to get a good understanding before we even start doing the questionnaire and the assessment and things like that. So, after we've talked with, or we've done the workshop and say, you're looking to do the zero trust assessment, usually what we do is we'd review the workshop findings. So any roadmap that we've created in that, and then we'll assess your organization's maturity. So we have a pre-assessment questionnaire that we created that's based very heavily off of Microsoft's assessment questionnaires that they ask about zero trust maturity. So we take those, kind of tweak them a little bit so they make a little bit more sense for the customer that we work with at the time. Once you answer those questions, and they're broken down into those 6 pillars we discussed earlier, the applications, identity, endpoints, data, infrastructure, network, there's questions in each of those pillars. After you answer those, we'll get a good idea of where you're at. And based on that, we can then use your maturity to curate an assessment for you to say, here's the low-hanging fruit that you can start with. So generally we'll say, we'll be leading the assessment and it'll just say, this one is a really important security control for zero trust. And it's also very low end user impacting, right? Let's get these done right away. And then, we'd move to very important, but medium impact, then very important and high impact, and then kind of keep going down that matrix of controls that we can let you basically decide when you want to implement those. We'll give recommendations, but again, our goal is really to create the recommendation set for you and let your team work off of their availability and the resources that you have available in your organization at that time. Because we've seen it time and again where when you just give organization or an IT team just 80 controls to implement, it just won't get done. It's you get overwhelmed and you just do nothing rather than starting with step 1. So after we kind of go through that assessment process, our deliverable documents will come out that'll basically list everything we've been talking to you about. You'll get a full set of recommendations. You'll get a matrix that lists where those recommendations align in impact and priority, to make sure that you know which one should go first, as well as where we got this information from. We're not just gonna, we're being hired to assess, but we're not just going to assume that you believe every single thing we say, right? We'll give you our discovery information, the Microsoft documentation and the information that backs up what we're saying. So we're not just saying it yet, like we're Virteva, do what we say, right? So again, really our goal is to curate that assessment for your organization and just provide those step-by-step security controls you can implement so that you can start moving toward a zero trust, a better zero trust state. And then hopefully eventually, once it starts to pick up steam and people understand it more and more, you'll eventually get to that optimal stage where you can have basically, every security control implemented and really protect that organization, explicitly verify every time somebody's signing in, get your just in time and just enough access set up, tip-top shape, and then always assume that you've been breached and be ready to respond to that breach and lock it down right when it happens. So with that, Scott, I will kick it back to you to close us out here.
All right, well said, Taylor. And kind of as Taylor alluded to, is it can be a lot for an organization to take on, especially when you're fairly new to zero trust. So we recognize that achieving zero trust inside your business, it can be a difficult task. We sincerely hope that today's webinar has been beneficial for all of you, whether you're just beginning that journey or you're already partway through to attaining zero trust. That being said, if you're looking for help from a trusted Microsoft partner, we're here to assist. So feel free to reach out. Kind of as I begin to wrap up for the day, I just wanted to take the opportunity here to thank Chris and Taylor for their time, as well as everybody else that took the time out of their day to watch the webcast live with us. As we've learned today, zero trust is a fundamental security concept that should no longer be disregarded or ignored. It really can't be anymore. It will continue to be a focus because of the way that we work today, the seriousness of the risks that are out there, and the impact that they can have on your organization, whether it be a big Fortune 500 company or just a kind of like a smaller one that's maybe only 100 to 200 employees. At this time, I wanted to open up the floor for questions. I didn't see any come in as we were going through the webcast, but if there are any questions for anyone in the audience, please feel free to use the chat feature in Teams. We've got about 5 minutes that we can go over those. Right. I'll give folks another minute or so here. Just might be a longer typed out answer that they need a little bit more time for. But as we kind of give folks time, Chris and Taylor, anything additional that you wanted to add that maybe we missed as we went over stuff today?
No, just that it's been interesting over the last couple of years. The pandemic obviously really accelerated, I think, for a lot of orgs how important zero trust ultimately was going to be, because they didn't have that, hey, everyone's in the office and we're going to protect them the old-fashioned way. It's not to say that was even that effective before the pandemic, but it exacerbated it because now you had all these remote staff working from home, working from all over the place. That approach to the staff location model, that genie's out of the bottle, and it's never really, no matter how much some organizations try, likely to go back to the way it was. And so zero trust is purpose built to accommodate a much more remote work, multifaceted way of accessing data that's not always going to be, behind the firewalls. It's a really good way to make sure that you've future-proofed yourself from a security perspective. And so if for no other reason, I think, again, it's not that zero trust didn't still apply and had its importance, but it's that much more critical in light of all the changes from the pandemic and how companies operate.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point there because, we see more and more now that like cybersecurity insurance, won't even provide you insurance unless you have certain controls in place. And Microsoft even is pushing people towards certain zero trust controls. They started to block legacy authentication methods without telling anybody. Who knows how long it'll be before MFA is enforced globally, by default, and you have to just exclude users from it, kind of thing. So if you can, get ahead of it now, it's great, because then you're with the curve instead of trying to run uphill and catch up to where Microsoft or cybersecurity insurance or whoever else is auditing you, is forcing you to be at. But
yeah, the insurance company one's been a big factor. We've seen a lot of that where the cost of cybersecurity insurance was significantly higher if they didn't attest and prove as an organization when they were buying that insurance that they'd met all these different variables. And lo and behold, most of them are zero trust focused. These cyber insurance companies know and understand the ins and outs of this. They pay good money, I'm sure, to consultants and other advisors to help them understand what's the best way to protect a company so that the insurance company can make the most money. And so they're not stupid. They know the things that work. And it's funny when you actually unpack. Whenever we see any of those cybersecurity insurance forums, a lot of them are just asking about all the same things that you would have done through a zero trust model. And I was just recently, interestingly enough, there was an article about, for purposes of a webinar, I won't reveal the names because even though it was a public news article, it's still sanctity and all that. But they actually were sued by the insurance company because the attestations that they gave that they were doing multi-factor and doing some other baseline zero trust foundational security things, they lied. The company didn't actually follow through, or they had done them and then deactivated on some of them. Kind of what you alluded to, Taylor, where they had too many exclusions, like the VIPs, like the C-levels were going, well, we did it, but I'm the CEO. I don't want to do it anymore. It's too distracting or something. And so they were breached, and the cybersecurity firm not only didn't cover them, but is suing them in court because of the fact that they lied on their attestations. And so it's not something that the insurance companies, it seems like, are in particular are accepting any longer as any sort of wishy-washiness or companies not fervently adhering to a lot of these concepts.
Yeah, it's not enough to trust some, right? And don't trust others. It's the zero trust, especially in the Microsoft world. If you're a full Microsoft company, right, and you're fully in the M365 stack, like you have E5s and things like that, and you haven't started embracing this, I highly recommend it, because Microsoft is just going to keep moving everything towards this security architecture as far as what they've said. So
great. Thanks for the additional insight. I'm sure that the audience appreciates it as well. Well, once again, I just wanted to thank everyone for their time today. If you liked what you heard today and you're looking for help in your zero trust journey, or you have any additional thoughts or questions on today's webcast that maybe come up later today or while you're eating dinner, please feel free to click on the link on the slide or email us directly at letstalk@virteva.com to contact us about a zero trust assessment and a workshop, which is often something that we're able to deliver to you at no additional cost, thanks to our ability to leverage Microsoft funding. So again, if you have the opportunity and you're interested in pursuing this, please feel free to visit us at virteva.com. We'd be happy to assist you as an implementation partner. And again, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
So long.
Thanks, everybody.